Welcome to Asia in Review. I'm your host. My guest today is Mr. Jim Kelly. Jim is a former U.S. State Department Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. He also is a retired military officer as well as a retired civil servant. He also served as National Security Advisor in the National Security Council during the Reagan administration. He's a counselor to Pacific Forum. He's also a board member of the Asia Foundation and also sits on the boards of some other organizations, companies on the East Coast. Our show today, U.S. Foreign Policy in Northeast Asia. Welcome to Asia in Review.
Bill, thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be here and talk about my favorite subject for the last 35 years, which is East Asia and its effects on the USA.
Great, great. Well, the big topic, there's a lot of big topics with East Asia these days, but I guess the one that most people most frequently talk about is the rebalance. So where are we in the rebalance?
Well, we're partly along. I think the effort first described as a pivot, which misled a lot of people. Rebalance has confused some in the region. But the fact is there has been some shift of American military forces into the Asian region, not all that much, but enough to signal that America needs to be interested in the most active and vital part of the world. Now, the rebalance has multiple efforts. It has political, security, and particularly economic interests. Economics are crucial to every country in East Asia, and it's very important that that be part of it. And the recent trade negotiation that continues on at this time, the so-called Trade Partnership for Peace, or TPP, I think is a key element of that. And so far, we haven't been able to deliver much on that. So it's a stool that has been set up with one or 1.5 sturdy legs and a third leg that is so far under construction. So the rebalance is a work in progress, and we'll just have to see how it progresses.
Well, the TPP, we're in sync here because I somehow wanted to talk about that, especially since the negotiations have been taking place here, right here in Hawaii, in Maui. And unfortunately, it didn't come out to much of a conclusion. But what's your take? Where are the talks going to go from here? Are they in danger?
Well, first of all, Trade Partnership for Peace was launched by President Obama during the APEC meeting here in Hawaii some 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. It was the centerpiece of the last meeting of the Asia-Pacific Economic Conference of countries that the U.S. held. And so it's been signaled for a long time. And it's been worked on, particularly over the last couple of years, quite diligently, I think, by the administration and its trade representatives. But this is 12 different countries involved in this. It's also often described as a free trade agreement. Well, let's just think about the basics. If you had a real free trade agreement, I think it might be 1 page long and suggest we have abolished all tariffs on everything, come ahead and trade whatever you want. But in fact, these free trade agreements turn out to be 1,000-page details about rules of origin and very details about tariffs on this and no tariffs on something else. The general direction is a progression, but we're talking about something enormously complicated. And so with the administration having received its what's called the Trade Promotion Authority, this used to be called Fast Track Authority because under the U.S. Constitution, it's the Congress that has the responsibility for trade primarily, as opposed to the administration has the key responsibility for foreign policy. And so as we look at this, The Congress has 535 members. I'm sure each one of them would like to negotiate the trade agreements with all of the other 12 countries in such a way to advantage their constituents, and that's simply impractical. So what we have in this Trade Promotion Authority, which President Obama got through by a very narrow margin early last month, is a situation in which the trade agreement, when it's finished, is provided in detail to the Congress, and for at least 90 days, the Congress gets to study it, and it can vote it up, it can vote it down, but it cannot take it apart and spread all the pieces around the table and try to put them together again. It has to vote it up or vote it down. So far, we don't have an agreement, and last week's meeting on Maui was intended to be a meeting that would bring it to a conclusion, but that did not happen.
What was the big problem, as you see it?
I don't know. It's happened so recently, and I've seen only incomplete reporting. I know that there are problems, I'm told, with the intellectual property and the length of time that certain biologicals will be under patent protection. That's an ongoing issue. Dairy, I think, has apparently turned into a big issue. It's not necessarily a big issue for the USA, but it is for countries like New Zealand and Australia and Canada, which otherwise is generally a very open country to trade, is highly protectionist of its dairy farmers. Canada, the Prime Minister has just announced that he is going to stand for election later this year, and it looks like Canada is not willing to go along with the provisions on dairy in this. So dairy, intellectual property, autos, there may be others. For example, the big news was supposed to be some breakthroughs with Japan that supposedly are all done, except they haven't been signed or announced.
Japanese agriculture.
Japanese agriculture in particular, Japanese agriculture has been historically strongly protected for a very long time.
Right.
And apparently Prime Minister Abe is willing to make some significant changes in that. But none of that was announced because it's not all done until the entire agreement is completed. And so right now the whole thing has been kicked off. There's a possibility of another meeting, I understand, in some 3 weeks or so. Who knows what's going on. It's definitely the kind of negotiation that one doesn't see every aspect of it while it's going on.
Mm. Where's the balance in the rebalance? And is it like 40% military, 60% economic, 50-50? You suggested a little while ago that it was mostly an economic issue, the rebalance, but how would you apportion I think the security part, the economic part?
What I would say is that the part of the rebalance that has had the least progress is on the economic side. Mm. For example, all of the East Asian countries' largest trading partner is China.
Right.
This is a reality, and it's certainly very, very important. China is not, at this time, a part of the TPP negotiations. China is talking about a much less rigorous agreement sort of thing that they're working with other partners and doing a number of other economic matters. So, but on rebalance, I would say it's roughly equal proportions of the political and the security and the economic. And the security part is the most well seen in that American forces are identified, and there have been these modest increases, a few ships deployed, some higher technology. Most, sort of 60% of the Navy's submarines are here in the Pacific. Mm-hmm. But if, in my opinion, if the U.S. tries to make the entire rebalance dependent on military alone, it will fail because the trade and economic issues are so important in the Asia Pacific. Every important political issue has a major economic component, and every economic issue has a major political component. And over all of them, there are these security concerns as well. And so that's something that has to be considered. So I would divide it up evenly. I don't think there's been any public assessment of I'm not sure how to measure all of these different things.
Of course, China's response has been, this is just an American attempt to contain us. And I know you've heard that before.
More about the military side of the rebalance, and that's something that is said. We also have this rather surprising activity in the South China Sea, in which China has identified certain rocks and shoals and brought out a load of dredges and started building islands on them. And they've done that on 6 or 7 islands in the South China Sea, which are claimed not just by China, but by other countries that are much closer to them than China is. So we have that sort of tension that's picked up. We have the Sino-U.S. relationship. We're going to have a very important time with that next month in September, because President Xi Jinping of China is coming to Washington for his first state visit to call on President Obama, and I think that'll be an important time. The Sino-U.S. relationship is certainly the most important single bilateral relationship in the world today. It is unique in all of its political and economic facts. For example, China owns about $1.4 trillion of American financial instruments, which it is used and accumulated by selling all kinds of products to the U.S. over quite a few years. So it's an exceptionally complex, uniquely complex situation. And China itself, its remarkable development over the last 30 years in particular, marks that it's now a global power. It's now the world's second largest economy, and by some measures, such as purchasing power parity, as it's called, may be the world's largest economy. As I mentioned, it's the leading trading partner of everybody in East Asia and many other countries around the world. Its use of resources, of energy, of raw materials for its products has been quite remarkable. But China has built its economy on an export-led, selling exports to others, and that model is probably outdated, and China is having some problems making changes.
When it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, a couple things that I'm always kind of curious about. Salami slicing, Chinese salami slicing, taking this potentially provocative action, kind of looking around, seeing what the reaction is. If there's no reaction, taking another mini step forward, but in the form of a provocative action, et cetera, et cetera. How should the U.S. deal with salami slicing?
Well, it's very difficult to deal with it, and I think you well describe what's going on, particularly these claims in the South China Sea. The only thing I would say is that as you suggest, slices are taken, perhaps the door is being pushed on a little bit. It's necessary to have it a little bit more firm to discourage China from continuing to push. But this is not the only issue here. What I was trying to get at before is that China is going through a profound set of economic reforms, and it's having a very difficult time doing this, as we have seen. China has had this remarkable growth, over 10% most of each of the last 30 years. This is absolutely unprecedented to have so much growth. It's now about 7%, maybe a little less than that. China's leadership feels, and of course the priorities of China's leadership are primarily internal. In other words, these salami tactics need to be kept in a certain perspective. It doesn't mean that they're to be ignored. It doesn't mean that we pretend that they are not there. They are there, and there are serious problems. But within the larger context, it's very important to see that that China's future is involved in these internal issues that are enormously difficult for any country to do, and certainly for China.
Good. Let's take a break here. You're watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Jim Kelly, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And we've been talking about U.S. foreign policy in Northeast Asia. We'll be right back.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Keith.
My name's Keith Bettinger.
I knew that.
And I'm the host of ThinkTech Asia.
I knew that too.
Here on ThinkTech.
Fabulous. You got a great show going, Keith.
Thank you very much. And for our viewers out there that are interested in ThinkTech Asia, it airs every Tuesday from 4 to 4:45, and it can be accessed online at thinktech.com.
Yeah, so what kind of guests you like?
Well, we have a number of guests from academia, from practitioners of international affairs. Sometimes we have military officials. Sometimes we have public officials on the show. And our goal, we try to talk about current issues in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Central Asia, all throughout the Asian realm in more depth than you would find in traditional mainstream
That's
media.
the difference, isn't it?
Exactly.
That you're reaching out beyond what ordinary news media would do.
Right.
That's why we like you so much.
We're trying to provide a thinking person's perspective, an intelligent perspective on what's going on, and we're both sides of the story, or even when there's more than two sides, we try to cover every angle. And I think that's one of the big benefits that we provide here at ThinkTech. Is it's a really innovative source of educational programming for the people of Hawaii.
You're great, Keith. You are a great host. You got a great show going on. I watch it every week.
Thanks very much.
Why don't you guys watch it every week too, okay?
4:45 to 4 to 4:45 every Tuesday.
Back with you here on Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Jim Kelly, former U.S. State Department Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. We've been talking about U.S. foreign policy in Northeast Asia. So what's your prediction? Is TPP going to make it?
We'll just have to see. Yes, I think TPP will make it, but it could be in the administration of the next president. We could be on a slow track. I think it does make an important difference over whether the issues themselves are so complex that it takes years longer to complete the agreement, as opposed to completing the agreement and having the U.S. Congress reject it out of hand. That, I think, would send a very adverse message to everyone in Asia, not just those who are involved in that particular trade agreement.
During the break, we got a question tweeted into us. I'll read it off the screen, and then I'd like to see what your response is. Does North Korea seriously have a million-man army with trained soldiers? If so, where are the bases in North Korea?
Well, first of all, I'm not a government official and haven't been for 10 years. But 10 years ago, and I believe now, they definitely had a million-man army out of a population of about 20 to 25 million people with trained soldiers. I think the basic draft conscript is in for 7 years or so. So it's a serious army. Where are the bases in North Korea? And I think the answer is they're pretty much all over North Korea, although they're certainly clustered along the demilitarized zone, that 125-mile zone that was set up by the armistice that was signed with North Korea in 1953. and that provides the boundary between North Korea and South Korea. There clearly are many of those soldiers along that line. But the question here is in the right track, because North Korea realizes that its technology and conventional forces has been lacking, and that, among other things, has led them to develop nuclear weapons, which I think North Korea may see as obviating the conventional threat that they have had for all these years to South Korea. But they still have a 1 million-man army. Sometimes the soldiers aren't doing all military tasks. When I visited North Korea as a non-official back in 1992, I recall in the spring driving along highways and seeing groups of Army trucks with soldiers that were helping the rice planting that was going on. One of the reasons they needed to do that is they had no mechanization at all, and so the soldiers were all out there up to their knees planting the rice plants. So when you have a 1 million-man army, you might use it for things other than getting ready to fight a war. But North Korea has worked, it's given priority to its army in the official ideology of the country, the so-called Songun process, and it remains a serious conventional threat, not to mention nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles.
Getting back to the U.S.-China relationship, what's your take on mill-to-mill relations? Are they achieving anything? I mean, there's some people that strongly advocate them. There's some people that are dubious about them. What's your take?
I think it's generally positive. I think both countries, certainly the U.S. military is under the control of our president and his appointees in the Congress. The Chinese army significantly is under the party and not under the government. These communications, I think, do lead to a little better understanding. I think there have been some agreements, I'm not sure exactly where they are now, but which deal with meetings at sea, in which procedures are set up to reduce the risk of some miscalculation or accidental collisions. Back in 2001, there was a tragic collision of a Chinese fighter plane and a U.S. patrol aircraft at the time. The only killed in action was the Chinese pilot, but it was a serious incident. And so some of this communication helps on that. But military-to-military contacts, I think, are a secondary part of a very broad and complex relationship.
Taiwan, a pretty interesting election forming up here for January, a kind of a dual election. At the same time, there will be a presidential election and an election for the legislature. The election seems to be receiving more and more attention in the press. What's your view of the upcoming January?
Well, I haven't been to Taiwan for about 2 years now, so I may be a little dated. We don't see as much interesting news as we might. But this is indeed, as you say, a very interesting election, because the ruling Kuomintang party, President Ma Ying-jeou, the president of Taiwan, democratically elected, is not able to succeed himself. And there has been a kind of a scramble within his party of lesser-known political individuals as to exactly who is going to run. The opposition, the Democratic Progressive Party, appears to be nominating its head, a lawyer, a woman named Tsai Ing-wen, and Madam Tsai, who lost a previous election, but a close one, is going to be a very strong candidate. So we may well have a major change of government in Taiwan over the next year or so.
Any predictions on the legislative race?
I have no idea where that's going to come out. We'll just have to see how it goes. There are serious political divisions in Taiwan, just as there are a lot of places, particularly with democracies, and Taiwan has a vibrant democracy. Taiwan has done a great job of its own development and its economic interactions with the mainland and with the rest of the world. Taipei once was a city that wasn't as fun to visit as it is now. It's even starting to be, in many respects, a rather beautiful city, which it was rarely accused of in the past. The Taiwan people have really done a great job with their country, and we wish them well. But the political division is very hard to see. The way I would judge it now, just to take a guess, I would say about 10% of the population would like to complete a total merger with China as soon as possible. 15, or perhaps even a little bit more, of the population would like to declare complete independence and be entirely separate from China. The rest of the people, I think, are more committed to the status quo because they see that neither of these alternatives are ones that they would particularly want, given the likelihood of a very adverse reaction from the People's Republic of China. China-Taiwan relations have really been quite good over the last 6 years, but it's an open question as to just how well they'll continue after this upcoming election.
Some people have suggested that there's a ramping up of U.S.-Taiwan relations going on, that Taiwan's friends in Congress are becoming more vocal and more effective. The administration seems to be more friendly towards Taiwan than it was in the past. There was a recent conference held at Bellows about amphibious forces, and Taiwan was invited. The PRC wasn't. Senator McCain is promoting the idea of inviting Taiwan to RIMPAC. Do you see a ramping up of U.S.-Taiwan relations?
I don't see that, but then I'm not in Washington and don't have necessarily a very clear view of it. I think Taiwan has always had a lot of support in the U.S. There was the old China lobby when Taiwan emphasized its status as the Republic of China and its claim to all of the land of China. That changed over the years, but with the democracy, with the economic achievements, I think there's a lot of support. But I would point out in 1995, I believe, or 1994, the Senate voted, I think, 95-1 in favor of encouraging a visit by President Lee Teng-hui, then the president of Taiwan, when the administration had been a little slow in facilitating his visit to America, not necessarily to Washington. So 95-1 is a hard level of support to improve on.
That's pretty impressive.
And so I think we're seeing a continuation of what's been the case for a long time.
We'll take another break here. You're watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, Phil Sharp. My guest today is Jim Kelly, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. We've been talking about U.S. foreign policy in Northeast Asia. We'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Miley Scarpino, and I'm the host of the Empower Hour. If you're interested in health, nutrition, fitness, here on the island of Oahu, want to learn more about places to train at or different trainers available, then watch my show on Fridays at 3. We have a great time, and I hope that you'll come join us. Much aloha. Now go get swole.
Aloha, my name is PJ and I'm the host of Hawaii Sports Update. I am very interested in local sports and that's why I host the Hawaii Sports Update show. I bring in guests from Hawaii, I bring in guests from UH, I bring in guests from the community, I bring in big names, I bring in small names, I bring in all names that are community related and doing positive things, sports related in the community. Come join me every Tuesday at 1 p.m. here on Hawaii Sports Update. You can also join me on my golf tournament, the first annual PJ Sports Radio Show golf tournament. It's going to be held at Coral Creek. For any information, go to ThinkTech, Hawaii, INC, and friend us. The PayPal and a summary of the event will be right there available for you. And don't forget to tweet us.
Welcome back to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Jim Kelly, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. We've been talking about China, we've been talking about Taiwan, we've been talking about the Rebalance and TPP. Now it's time to talk about Japan. Mr. Abe. Abe the second time around is certainly a lot different than Abe the first time around. I mean, these are like two different people. And
Well, he was quite sick
Yeah.
that first time, so maybe it's another vote for what good health can do for an older gentleman.
right. Well, where do you stand on his ideas about, collective self-defense?
These are very complicated questions that Japanese themselves have to resolve, and as an ex-official, officials really need to stay out of that sort of advice. But from the viewpoint of most Americans, I would say, the collective self-defense is absolutely not a rearmament of Japan in some sort of replay, as some critics try to portray it, of the 1930s. Japan's constitution prohibits it from any participation in war. It has interpreted this constitution enough to have rather capable, but very small, self-defense forces over this time. But they're very limited in the sort of things that they can do. So that, for example, if North Korea attacked South Korea and the U.S. as a ally of South Korea went to their defense, and Japanese planes, Japanese ships were at sea and noted a North Korean missile was being fired toward an American ship, under the present rules, that would be a violation of the Japanese Constitution to have them interfere with the North Korean missile aimed at Japan's ally. So the changes that Prime Minister Abe is trying to do through a means of reinterpretation of the Constitution and some two particular legislative enactments that he has pending in the Diet or legislature of Japan. These items would permit Japan to take some action in certain very limited cases. The whole thing is dependent on situations that are so abstract or so remote in many cases that it leads to a lot of head scratching over what it's involved. But it's turned into a big domestic political issue in Japan, one that I'm sure Japanese are going to work out for themselves over this time.
In a sense, doesn't Mr. Abe want to do the things that Americans have sort of encouraged Japan to do for some time, but he's bold enough to go against the grain, the
Certainly, Prime
popular
Minister
grain?
Abe is trying to reach the late, great Ambassador Mike Mansfield to Japan often pointed out that the Japan-U.S. relationship was the most important in the world, bar none. And sadly, Mike Mansfield was always right. It remains an extremely important relationship, I think some would argue that the Sino-U.S. relationship may be more critical to American interests and, for that matter, Japanese interests than was the case in the past. So Japan is also feeling, in some respects, threatened, certainly by North Korea, but also by China in some respects over these seriously divided claims to certain small uninhabited islands in the East China Sea. So this is quite natural for Japanese leaders to, under these circumstances, to emphasize the relationship that he has with the U.S. as an ally. But at the same time, he is also trying to reform the Japanese economy, which has been in the doldrum now for more than 20 years, and really needs to get out. But the demographics are against this. I heard an interesting fact last week that Japan has the same number of people between the ages of 75 and 79 that it has between the ages of 5 and 9. Wow. And never in the history of the world has any country ever had a demographic of that nature. In other words, Japan is aging much more rapidly than its younger population is coming along, and this limits how strong the economy can be. Japan's population has reduced over recent years. Its workforce has reduced, and this is a part of the economic realities that certainly have got the attention of Japanese political leaders.
You know, it seems that although a lot of the U.S. policy is based on the notion that Asia is the most important economic center of economic growth in the world, therefore we need to be represented in Asia. We need to have a presence. We need to have a position. Yet this demographic challenge is one that's being experienced by all countries in Northeast Asia, by Korea, by Japan, by China. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we, continually assess the importance of Asia to the United States.
And in the world, and of course, India will surpass China as the largest population in the world, probably sometime within the next 10 years or so. We have in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, a much smaller population, of course, than that of China, but a very high percentage of young Vietnamese dedicated to education. And so the demographics cut in different ways in Southeast Asia, in India, and in China and Northeast Asia, which have got the low population replacement. China, of course, had for many years its one-child policy. It has now chosen to modify this, but the numbers don't seem to be coming along. The development is such that most couples are not having multiple children in China, other than in the provinces and distant parts of the country among minority groups.
It just occurred to me the other day, I don't know, I never thought about this very much before, but if I look at the leaders of Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, China, they're all sort of the progeny of political blue bloods. Xi Jinping's father was one of the founders of the PRC. Park Geun-hye, obviously her father was a very prominent president of South Korea. And Mr. Abe's family history has loads of previous leaders. I don't know, does that tell us anything about East Asia that we should keep in mind? Well, and of course we could go one step further and go to North Korea and Kim Jong-un. And I think his family history is pretty obvious.
Well, the problem of legacies in politics is not unique to East Asia. I notice some of the leading candidates here in the USA are named Clinton and Bush. So
good point.
There are these practices, and I'm not sure I can draw any strong conclusion. I think President Xi Jinping is a particularly interesting leader of China, clearly bringing considerable power to himself, more so than his recent predecessors. He's very much in charge. He's very much leading some changes, especially his efforts against corruption in China, which have certainly felled some big old trees, so to speak, of senior political officials and army officials that have been taken down by President Lee. But his leadership is obviously designed to preserve the monopoly leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. And above all, he seems to be a party man, determined to maintain the system, whatever it takes.
We've got about 1 minute left, so let me ask you this question. Is there going to be a red line for Xi Jinping, a line on which he cannot cross before there's blowback? I've heard the Hong Kong press, sometimes I believe it, sometimes I don't. But there was one report that I read that there had been a couple of assassination attempts on his life. Of course, that's not published in papers in China. But is there a red line?
I don't like the whole concept of red lines. I
Okay.
think they move too much. There obviously is some dissatisfaction within China with President Lee. It would be inevitable to have a leader so strong that didn't strike some people the wrong way. Whether that's leading to any significant opposition, I can't say. It may be showing up, though, in a very interesting way, which is capital flight and capital leaving China. A very difficult and very important thing to analyze. But if Chinese people are buying very expensive condos in Honolulu or very expensive apartments in New York City, that may be a way of signaling that they're less than 100% optimistic about China's future or their own personal future within that context.
That's a really good way to put it. That's a really good way to put it. We've come down to the end here. You've been watching Asia in Review. My guest today has been Jim Kelly, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. We've had a really good conversation that's touched on a lot of issues. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you again right here next week, same place, same time.